Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here. My name is Kirsten, as Alicia said, and I'm from Singapore, but New Naratif is a platform that covers Southeast Asia. So apart from Singapore, we cover also East Timor, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, and have I reached 10 already? I don't think I have. But you get the idea. So it's everybody in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations plus East Timor. And that's over 655 million people of different ethnicities, languages, cultures, religions. But we all kind of share similar struggles in some ways. For example, this is Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index for this year, and this is how all the countries that we cover rank. And as you can see, it's not a very pretty picture. For context, it only ranks 180 countries, so you see it gets quite low down there. And so across the region, journalists in Southeast Asia face, oppressive laws, censorship, self-censorship, arrests, intimidation, sometimes even violence. And so it's really difficult sometimes to get stories out, particularly if you work in local mainstream media, where sometimes it's either government influence, if not outright state-controlled, state-owned. And so in these cases, the story never comes first because it's about keeping your job, it's about dealing with the government censors. So politically sensitive stories, controversial stories, don't make it into the mainstream media. And so people think about, where do we go to read about Southeast Asia? And now with the internet, a lot of people actually read about Southeast Asia based on what the foreign media covers on Southeast Asia. So we go on the website, we look at what New York Times is saying, what The Guardian is saying, what the BBC is saying about Southeast Asia. But who do these international press outlets actually serve? Who are their target audiences? And what are they, in a way, pandering to? So as a freelance journalist in Singapore, I'm very often told that, this story is too local, it doesn't have an international angle, or the most kind of outrageous one that I've been told before is that it requires too much explaining. So, there's no point in doing this story because we need to explain too much, which I had thought was, my job, and that's why I was pitching it. But apparently it takes too much explaining. So we have a lot of these. I've seen a lot of kind of generalizations and oversimplifications of Southeast Asia because the audiences that they pander to have particular stereotypes and misconceptions about Southeast Asia. So these are just some examples that I kind of crowdsourced from our writers on New Naratif. So, tell me something that people tell you or say to you when you say you live in some country in Southeast Asia. So one writer said, when I moved to Vietnam, my aunt asked me if there were traffic lights there. Someone asked somebody living in Medan, which is the 4th largest city in Indonesia, if they have a mall. I personally, as a freelance journalist in Singapore, got more requests from Western editors when the film Crazy Rich Asians came out than when we had elections, when activists were arrested. Nobody was interested in those, but Crazy Rich Asians, I was turning down interview requests and also commissions about 3 times a day. So again, the story doesn't really come first because it's about people's ideas of Southeast Asia. And it really affects us in Southeast Asia as well, because if we can't read in our local media about one another, and we can't read in the foreign media about one another, then what do we actually know about each other? So who is telling Southeast Asia's stories? What stories are out there that we're not seeing because the local media can't touch it and the foreign media won't? What stories are we not seeing because they're printed in local media, in local languages that we can't read? And what talent is out there in Southeast Asia that we don't pick up on because they never get a byline in The Guardian or the New York Times because maybe their English is not strong enough and an editor wouldn't take a chance on them? So when we started New Naratif, which was a year ago, it started because my friend, Dr. PJ Thum, had this idea, and he's not a journalist, he's a historian. And he had this issue where he felt like there was a lot of really good research that was being done about Southeast Asia that nobody in Southeast Asia was actually reading because they would be written in really dense language and then they would be printed in academic journals that basically nobody can afford unless you're already attached to a university. And so he got in touch and he said, how can we make this more accessible? And we, for a while, talked about the idea of linking researchers with journalists and, turning the stories into human interest stories. But then when we talked about it, we felt like there was even more space, that gap between what the local media can't cover and what the foreign media won't. That is a huge gap in Southeast Asia for Southeast Asian stories. And then we also added comics for art, Southeast Asian artists who need to get their work out. And we are also working on videos and podcasts so that we can deliver stories in a whole range of mediums to cater to people who like to consume information in different ways. We want to work with journalists and contributors who are based in the countries that they are writing about and as much as possible, as close to where they are writing about. So we have, for example, consulting editors in Indonesia, but we don't just want an Indonesian consulting editor. We go by the region. So we have a consulting editor for Jakarta and Papua, but we also have a consulting editor for North Sumatra. And they're very different regions, and they actually have a lot of arguments between Indonesian editors about even how the language is spoken in different parts of the country. And we also want to connect Southeast Asian journalists to work together to do cross-border stories. So whether they're in different cities of the same country or in different parts of the country or in different countries in the region, we would like to work more on cross-border stories about Southeast Asia because we are very connected in a lot of ways, but we don't often see it because our local media kind of operate in silos, focusing on the local country but not seeing the region as a whole. And as a Singaporean, I know that Singapore prefers to kind of compare itself to cities like Hong Kong, Tokyo, London, and New York, than to cities just right next to us. And so we felt really that we needed to build more connection within our region. And there are just so many stories. So for example, how many of you know that in parts of Malaysia and Singapore, there is a Creole that's spoken that's a mix of Malay and Portuguese called Kristang. Or in Malaysia, there's a very, very small and very, very strange fringe of Malay underground music bands who are neo-Nazis. Malay neo-Nazis, think about that. That's really, I don't know why. Or, that in Indonesia, the stigma against LGBT people is so strong that they are submitting themselves to religious exorcism to try to get the gay out of them through exorcism. And these are all stories that we've covered, and we didn't necessarily know that about each other. So New Naratif, with our different sections, we work with writers even if they've never been published before, even if they're still students, because we publish new features twice a week. So we don't try to take on the breaking news. So that means that we have time. If your edit needs 5 rounds of revisions, it needs 5 rounds of revisions, and we will work with you to get you there. And it's about basically taking a chance on new writers and on young writers so that they have a byline, so that they can build a portfolio, and maybe they can go on to bigger publications. That would be great, but if they wanted to stay with us, that would be good too. And it's just about being the platform that took a chance on them. Thanks to our team in Indonesia, we have 2 part-time editors there at the moment. We also accept stories in Indonesian. So people who aren't comfortable writing in English can write in Bahasa Indonesia, and then we collaboratively edit it with a bilingual editor that goes between Indonesian and English, and then we publish both. We've also had translators who translate the story to Bahasa Malaysia, which when we started, I thought that Bahasa Indonesia and Bahasa Malaysia were so close that they were interchangeable, and then I learned that they weren't. We've also had volunteer translators translate into Vietnamese and to Mandarin. And so we also publish them in a way with all the different languages next to each other. We don't publish different sections for them because we want Southeast Asians to experience the content in the same way that you experience Southeast Asia. When you go out on the street, you will hear all these different languages at once. We also refuse to categorize our content by countries because we find that that was really common, that international and regional websites categorize their content by countries, which just means that you go to the site, you click to the subcategory that is your country, and you never read about anything else. So we wanted people, when they come to newnaratif.com, to see Southeast Asian stories, even if it's not from your country. On 8th September, we put up a paywall because we don't take advertising, and so our sustainable model was memberships, where people subscribe to us for $52 a year. And we put up the paywall because that's how we need to be sustainable, but we didn't want to separate our audience into those who can afford to pay and those who can't afford to pay. So we actually took a leaf of the correspondence model and we made the paywall porous so that members can share the story with any number of people that they want anytime. And when we share the stories on our own social media platforms, we use our own accounts to share the stories. So anyone who clicks on New Naratif stories on Facebook most likely will see that they were gifted an article by me or something like that. So it's mostly a symbolic paywall to remind people that stories cost money, but at the same time, we don't want to cut anyone off. But we don't just want to be a new narrative in Southeast Asia in terms of stories. We also want to be a new model in terms of behavior and operation. So in Southeast Asia, when a lot of governments are really authoritarian, there's not a lot about transparency and accountability. A lot of stuff is top-down and it happens in black boxes, and then the decree or the order just comes down and it happens. And you don't really know how it happened, you don't really know what's going on. So New Naratif wants to show that it is possible to be open and to be transparent, which is why we aren't afraid of publishing our full financial statements so you can see how much money we have, how we spent it. And we want to show that it is possible to operate in a way without hiding. And if people disagree with the way we spend money, then people disagree and we can take that criticism. A lot of times governments feel like they'd rather hide things so they don't have to deal with the criticism that might come from people knowing. But we want to show that it is possible to be open, for people to look at what we are doing before they subscribe to us, or for members to see that we're responsible with the money that they've given us. And besides that, we also want to show that it's possible to be ethical, because New Naratif is very much published and powered by freelancers. So in our journalism section, for example, we are all freelancers. There isn't anybody in New Naratif who is working full-time. So I'm chief editor, but I also freelance, and all our writers are freelancers, which is why for us as an ethical model, to put the story first is to treat your freelancers well, hence the t-shirt, So it's really important to us that we pay our freelancers. Pay your freelancers on time, because, because it makes sense, right? You pay your freelancers on time, they'll be willing to write for you some more. And also, the less time we spend tracking invoices and sending emails to Chase, remember to pay my invoice, hey, I'm just following up to see if you got that invoice, that you get the bank details wrong because I didn't get payment, which is really just code to I didn't get payment, but I'm just giving you a way out. The less time freelancers spend doing that, the more time freelancers have to go out and chase the story. And so it's really important to us that we pay on time. So far, we've been able to pay on the day that the invoice is filed. We also pay before publication, because as I said, we only publish twice a week, and I felt that it was unreasonable to expect a freelancer to wait for me to publish the story before they got paid, because they've already done the work. So why should they wait for me to publish the story when, they've already completed their end of the bargain? And so we do that as well, to pay freelancers on time, just to make sure that everybody is working fairly and supporting each other. We put all our freelancers in a Slack channel if they want. If they don't want to join in, that's fine. But otherwise, everybody's in a Slack channel. We talk about other publications. We look out for each other. If there are other publications that don't pay, we warn each other. There's a shared spreadsheet of editor contacts, so we don't expect everybody in our Slack channel to only talk about us. We share other editor contacts so that, maybe they have a story that they feel like they could pitch to a bigger place than us. We understand. And so it's about that climate of support and collaboration that we want to build among freelancers in Southeast Asia. At the moment, there are a lot of countries in which a lot of the reporters are still kind of expats from the US or the UK or Europe living in Southeast Asian countries. And that's fine because a lot of them have spent many years there and they're very committed to the country and we're very happy to work with them. But we also want to get to a point where local Southeast Asians are able to come out and report on their own countries. And we work together to achieve that. And so it's not always smooth sailing. There are a lot of challenges. There are a lot of practical challenges, like just from manpower issues, and also a really steep learning curve because between a journalist and a historian, none of us have any business sense whatsoever. So we needed volunteers who were good with money to tell us, stop saying yes to everything that sounds exciting because you can't actually afford to do that. And we had to learn a lot. But we've also had, other challenges. So for example, New Naratif's parent company is registered in the UK, and we decided it would be safest to register the parent company outside of the region, and I'm sure you can guess at why after I've shown you the World Press Freedom Index. But we wanted to register New Naratif in Singapore, where I live, where I'm from, and we wanted to have a sort of legal basis to operate in Singapore. But not only were we rejected by the government issued a press release to say that we were clearly political in nature, that we had taken money from George Soros' Open Society Foundation, and therefore this was a case of foreigners using locals to meddle in domestic affairs. And, they published, so this is a spread in our local mainstream media broadsheet. It's the only English language general news mainstream broadsheet in Singapore. So this went everywhere. So this is the whole page. So you can see how huge that photo of our faces are. With the photo of George Soros, who I've never met. But apparently we are all the key players now in this scheme. And so we're not allowed to have a legal presence in Singapore, which just meant that we went next door and registered in Malaysia. We are also registering in Indonesia. And so it's not easy to do this sort of work in Southeast Asia, even though we don't feel like we've been that confrontational so far, but Southeast Asian governments are not really used to people who just want to tell all these stories and people who want to build community and build networks, because it's seen as political, which means that it's seen as a challenge to power. And so we're still really committed to building these Southeast Asian networks. So the effect of this denial of registration in Singapore is that we had to suspend our open meetings with members in Singapore, and we had to suspend these democracy classroom sessions that we did where we invited people to come in and talk about Singapore current affairs. So we suspended them because when they denied us registration, lawyers that we talked to couldn't decide if these offline events would be illegal, because in Singapore we also have public assembly laws that say even a single person can constitute an illegal assembly if you don't have a permit. So yes, today, actually in Singapore today, a performance artist is standing trial for being in an illegal public procession, which means that he was holding a mirror and walked down a street by himself, and he's on trial today. And so we had to suspend those, but the website hasn't stopped operating. We still publish 2 features a day with 2 translations following. We still have a weekly column of stories to watch in Southeast Asia. We, in fact, added podcasts, 1 podcast on Southeast Asian stories and 1 podcast of roundtable discussions on Singaporean issues. And we are still looking forward to building more, because we believe that when we know more about each other in the region, we can build more networks and more solidarity, more opportunities to work together to find solutions, and basically to build a Southeast Asian community, to learn that there is strength in understanding each other. And so we're really grateful for opportunities like the one that Outriders has given us today to talk about our work in Southeast Asia and to invite all of you on this journey together. So thank you very much.